On the morning of March 25, 1927, the Gare du Nord in Paris functioned as a cathedral of industrial progress and social stratification. Designed by architect Jacques Ittorf, the station's facade featured 23 statues representing the cities served by the Chemin de Fer du Nord. Inside, the massive iron and glass roof trapped the sulfurous exhaust of steam locomotives, creating a dense metallic fog. At 11:30 a.m., the station was a chaotic intersection of the European elite and the working class. Alice de Janzé moved through this fog with a calculated, predatory grace. She was dressed in a leopard skin coat that cost approximately $2,000 at the time, a staggering $36,000 in 2026 purchasing power. Her scent, Mitsuko by Guerlain, was a complex blend of peach, jasmine, and May rose, a fragrance created in 1919 to evoke the doomed heroine of the novel, La Bataille. In her hand, concealed within a silk handbag, she gripped a .25 caliber pocket pistol. This weapon, likely a Spanish-made Vesta or a Belgian FN model 1905, was a marvel of compact engineering. It measured less than 5 inches in length, utilized a 6-round magazine of 6.35 mm Browning ammunition, and was designed for concealment rather than combat. Its effective range was minimal, but at point-blank range, its low-velocity rounds were devastatingly lethal. Her target was Raymond de Trafford, a scion of one of England's oldest Catholic families, the de Traffords of Croston Hall. Raymond was the quintessential remittance man, a younger son whose main occupations were gambling, debt accumulation, and the pursuit of married women. He was attempting to board the boat train to London, fleeing a relationship that had become a suffocating psychodrama. As the conductor signaled the departure, Alice approached the first-class carriage. These carriages were the pinnacle of 1920s travel engineering, featuring mahogany paneling, plush cream velvet upholstery, and individual heating controls, a luxury that cost a passenger roughly $25 for a cross-channel journey, equivalent to $450 today. Without a word, Alice drew the .25 caliber and fired. The first bullet struck Raymond in the chest, narrowly missing his heart. As he slumped onto the velvet seat, Alice turned the muzzle toward herself and fired a second round into her abdomen. The sharp, mechanical crack of the pistol was momentarily lost in the hiss of the steam pistons, but the screams that followed were unmistakable. The French police, the Sûreté, arrived within minutes. They found a scene that defied the rigid social etiquette of the era. Blood, a viscous crimson, pooled on the cream velvet, soaking into the fibers of the expensive upholstery. The chemistry of the era's gunpowder, smokeless nitrocellulose, left a faint, acrid residue on Alice's leopard fur. This was a crime passionnel, a legal concept deeply embedded in the French Napoleonic Code. Under Article 324, the law often showed leniency toward acts of violence driven by uncontrollable impulse or betrayed love. However, the public saw something else, the rot at the heart of the post-war aristocracy. While the French economy was struggling with the franc germinal stabilization policies and a massive national debt of 280 billion francs, $1, 5 trillion today, the Happy Valley set was playing out violent fantasies in public transit hubs. Alice was rushed to the Beaujon Hospital, her survival as uncertain as the reputation she had just obliterated. This was not merely a domestic dispute. It was a structural failure of a class that had too much capital and too little purpose. The shooting at Gare du Nord signaled the beginning of a relentless scrutiny that would eventually dismantle the immunity of the Gilded Age's survivors. But to understand why Alice de Janzé reached for a pistol in a crowded train station, one must look at the industrial slaughterhouses of the American Midwest, where every drop of blood was converted into a dividend. Alice de Janzé was born Alice Silverthorne in Buffalo, New York in 1899, but her true lineage resided in the grisly, hyper-efficient heart of Chicago, the Union Stockyards. Her grandfather, Philip Danforth Armour, was the Meat King, a man who revolutionized the disassembly line decades before Henry Ford applied the concept to automobiles. By the time of Alice's birth, Armor & Co-Manners was an industrial titan, slaughtering 14 million animals annually. The stockyard spanned 375 acres of Southside Chicago, a labyrinth of wooden pens and brick killing floors where the logistics of death were perfected. P.D. Armour famously boasted that his plants used everything but the squeal. This was achieved through chemical engineering. Blood was turned into fertilizer, hooves into glue, and organs into pharmaceutical extracts. By his death in 1901, P.D. Armour left a fortune of $50 million, which translates to a gargantuan $1.8 billion in 2026. This wealth was built on the reefer car, the refrigerated rail car that used a system of ice bunkers and salt to transport fresh beef across the continent, shattering local butcher monopolies and centralizing American protein production. Alice grew up in the shadow of this empire of chops. Her childhood was a study in Gilded Age isolation. While the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, prompted by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, was forcing her family to modernize their facilities, Alice was being molded by the rigid protocols of the American plutocracy. She lived in a mansion on Prairie Avenue, a neighborhood designed by architects like Richard Morris Hunt to resemble European palaces. These homes featured limestone facades, 20-foot ceilings, and a staff-to-family ratio of 4:1. The cost of maintaining such a household exceeded $100,000 annually in 1910, or roughly $3.2 million today. Her mother, Annie Mae Armour, died when Alice was only 8, leaving her to be raised by a succession of governesses and a father, William Silverthorne, who was more interested in the social prestige of European travel than in the emotional development of his daughter. The Armour philosophy was one of cold, calculated expansion. Emotions were overhead costs that needed to be minimized. In 1920, Alice came into her primary inheritance, a $1 million trust fund. In 2026 value, this represents $15.5 million in liquid assets. To the public, she was a dollar princess, one of the many American heiresses whose wealth was used to prop up the crumbling estates of the European nobility. However, the Chicago she left behind was changing. The race riots of 1919 and the rise of organized labor were threatening the Armour hegemony. Her uncle, J. Ogden Armour, would eventually lose $100 million in a single year, $1.5 billion today, due to post-war price collapses and bad speculation. Alice, sensing the decline, liquidated much of her interest in the family business and moved toward the older, more refined decadence of Paris. She was a product of the Progressive era's greatest paradox. A woman with the financial power of a sovereign state, but the legal and social agency of a decorative object. Her education at finishing schools had prepared her for ballrooms, not the psychological warfare of the Happy Valley set. She carried with her the Armour trait of ruthless acquisition, but she applied it to people rather than meat-packing plants. Her wealth allowed her to ignore the social tremors of the early 1920s, the hyperinflation in Germany, the rise of the Bolsheviks, and the shifting gender roles in the wake of the Great War. For Alice, money was not a tool for building, but a shield against reality. She viewed the world through the optics of a consumer who had already purchased everything available. The Chicago stockyards had taught her that life was a commodity to be processed, packaged, and sold. It was a lesson she would soon apply to the Count Frédéric de Janzé, a man whose title was as ancient as his bank account was empty. She had the world at her feet, but Chicago's industrial chill had already settled in her marrow, and the darkness was beginning to outgrow the city's skyline. By 1921, the social architecture of post-war Europe was undergoing a radical restructuring. The ancient houses of the European aristocracy, bled dry by the logistical and financial costs of the Great War, were forced into a desperate symbiosis with the industrial titans of the United States. It was in this atmosphere of transactional romance that Alice Silverthorne encountered Count Frédéric de Janzé. Frédéric was the embodiment of the old blood in decline. His family's lineage was impeccable, but their coffers were depleted by the devaluation of the French franc and the rising costs of maintaining ancestral estates. The marriage, celebrated with a cold, geometric precision, was a merger of Chicago's raw industrial power and the refined social legitimacy of the French Faubourg Saint-Germain. Alice brought to the Union a dowry that functioned as a massive capital injection, roughly $1.3 million in 1921 currency, which represents $20, $2 million in 2026 purchasing power. This wealth was not merely a safety net. It was the fuel for a lifestyle that the French aristocracy could no longer afford on its own. The couple established their residence in a sprawling apartment on the Rue de Varennes, located in the 7th arrondissement of Paris. This neighborhood was the epicenter of the Hôtel Particulier, grand private mansions designed for the extreme social segregation of the elite. Their home was a museum of the Louis XV style, characterized by rocaille motifs, intricate marquetry, and furniture by master ébénistes like Jean-Pierre Latz. The technical maintenance of such an environment required a subterranean layer of labor, a staff of 12, including a maître d'hôtel, several valets de chambre, and specialized cleaners for the boule work clocks and savonnerie carpets. To heat such a space in 1922 cost the equivalent of $4,500 per month today, utilizing coal-fired boilers that required constant manual stoking. In this setting, Alice was transformed into the Comtesse de Jancy, a title that acted as a social camouflage for her American origins. However, the Faubourg was a closed system. Despite her wealth, she was always viewed as a dollar princess, a necessary but inherently vulgar American transplant. Frédéric de Jancy, however, was less interested in the nuances of Parisian etiquette than in the violent physics of the internal combustion engine. He became a prominent figure in the burgeoning world of Grand Prix racing, specifically favoring the Bugatti Type 35. To understand Frédéric is to understand the Type 35. It was the pur sang, thoroughbred of automobiles, a masterpiece of Ettore Bugatti's engineering. It featured a 2.0-liter straight-eight engine with a unique overhead camshaft and an integrated cylinder head. Its hollow front axle saved unsprung weight, and its signature aluminum wheels, with integrated brake drums, were a metallurgical revolution. Owning and racing such a machine in 1924 was an exercise in extreme expenditure. A single Type 35 cost approximately $5,000, $86,000 today, not including the logistical costs of transport, mechanics, and high-octane fuel. While Frédéric pursued the green hell of the Nürburgring, or the high-speed straights of Le Mans, Alice was left in the stifling silence of their apartment, surrounded by $300,000 worth of tapestries that offered no companionship. The macroeconomic landscape of France in the mid-1920s was one of the Roaring Twenties, or les années folles. But beneath the surface, the Cartel de Gauche government was struggling with a flight of capital and a currency that was rapidly losing its gold-backed stability. For Alice, this meant her American dollars possessed an almost supernatural purchasing power. She could buy a custom-made gown from Jean Patou or Coco Chanel for the equivalent of $3,500 today, a price that represented 3 years of wages for a Parisian seamstress. She was frequently photographed by Man Ray and other avant-garde artists, her image captured via magnesium flash powder, a volatile mixture of magnesium and potassium perchlorate that produced a blinding 1/50th of a second burst of light and a cloud of white smoke. In these portraits, Alice appears as a statuesque icon of the era, but the technical reality of her life was one of profound chemical and emotional dependence. She began to frequent the American bars of the right bank, where the cocktails were mixed with a precision that mirrored the family's meat processing plants, yet the emptiness remained. As the 1924 season approached, the boredom had become a pathology. The marriage was a functional vacuum. Frédéric's obsession with speed and Alice's growing alienation created a volatile internal pressure. It was then that Frédéric suggested a hunting trip to the British Crown colony of Kenya. At the time, Kenya was being marketed as a white man's country, a playground for the European elite where land was cheap and the social laws of the continent did not apply. The logistics of such a journey were immense, requiring a steamship voyage from Marseille to Mombasa, followed by a narrow-gauge railway journey into the highlands. Alice saw it not as a vacation, but as an escape from the gilded cage of the Rue de Varennes. She did not yet realize that she was moving from a refined prison to a wilderness where the lack of bars would prove even more dangerous. The search for a genuine pulse would eventually lead Alice across the equator, into a valley where the shadows were longer and the moral constraints of civilization simply evaporated. The Janzés arrived in the Wanjohi Valley of Kenya in 1924, entering a colonial ecosystem that was geographically isolated and socially untethered. This region, situated 7,000 feet above sea level in the Aberdare Range, became known as the Happy Valley. The geography was crucial to its character. The high altitude and cool climate allowed for a European lifestyle, while the distance from the colonial capital of Nairobi ensured that the High Commissioner's oversight was non-existent. The valley was part of the Soldier Settlement Scheme, a post-WWI initiative to populate the highlands with British officers. However, by 1924, the original settlers were being replaced by the international jet set of the era. Individuals with enough wealth to ignore the agricultural failures of the region and focus entirely on the pursuit of pleasure. For Alice, the Wanjohi Valley represented the ultimate luxury, the ability to live without consequences. The epicenter of this decadence was Clouds, the home of Lady Edina Sackville. Edina was the Queen of Happy Valley, a woman who had been married 5 times and whose lifestyle was a direct assault on Edwardian morality. The architecture of the valley reflected this erratic energy. While some lived in mud and thatch bungalows, the elite built stone manors like Jinn Palace, a Moorish-style fortress commissioned by Major Cyril Ramsay Hill. The palace featured whitewashed walls, intricate tilework, and internal courtyards designed to keep the African sun at bay. The technical feat of building such a structure in the 1920s bush was monumental. Every bag of cement and every pane of glass had to be hauled by ox cart from the railhead at Gilgil, a journey that could take days during the rainy season. To maintain their standard of living, the Happy Valley set imported crates of champagne, silk bedsheets, and the latest gramophone records. The cost of a single dinner party, where caviar was served in the middle of the African highlands, could easily exceed $10,000 in 2026 values. Social life in the valley was dictated by a switch marriage culture. The phrase, "Are you married or do you live in Kenya?" became the unofficial motto of the set. Alice found herself in the company of Jocelyn Hay, the 22nd Earl of Errol, a man of staggering charisma and zero financial ethics. Errol was the quintessential predator of the Highlands, using his title to gain access to the trust funds of bored heiresses. The macro context of the British Empire at this time was one of indirect rule, a policy designed by Lord Lugard to manage colonies with minimal British personnel. In Kenya, this meant that as long as the white settlers didn't cause a political uprising, the colonial police, the King's African Rifles, ignored their domestic scandals. This lack of legal friction allowed Alice's darker impulses to flourish. She began to experiment with the local pharmacopoeia. In 1924, morphine and heroin were not yet the strictly controlled substances they are today. They were often available via mail order or through sympathetic doctors who categorized addiction as neurasthenia or tropical fatigue. Alice's lifestyle in the valley was a perverse parody of her grandfather's industrial efficiency. She managed her house and her affairs with a cold, detached precision. She spent hours in the saddle, riding across the Rift Valley, often accompanied by a small menagerie of animals, including a pet cheetah and several Sykes' monkeys. These animals were not pets in the traditional sense. They were accessories, living extensions of her eccentricity. The cost of maintaining her Kenyan estate and her social standing was roughly $150,000 a year, $2.3 million today, funded entirely by the Armour dividends. While the local Kikuyu and Maasai populations were being systematically displaced by colonial land acts, specifically the 1915 Crown Lands Ordinance, Alice and her cohort were busy organizing treasure hunts, where the prizes were often sexual partners or high-stakes gambling debts. The pharmacological reality of Happy Valley was fueled by the gimlet and the pink gin. The chemistry of these drinks was specific. Plymouth gin mixed with Rose's lime juice to prevent scurvy, a lingering naval tradition, or Angostura bitters, At high altitudes, the physiological effects of alcohol are amplified. The lower oxygen levels in the blood lead to faster intoxication and impaired judgment. This altitude sickness of the soul was a defining characteristic of the Janze's time in Kenya. It was here that Alice met Raymond de Trafford, a man whose reputation for self-destruction matched her own. Raymond was a compulsive gambler who had been sent down to the colonies after accumulating debts in London that even his aristocratic family could not settle. He was the remittance man par excellence, living on a monthly stipend sent from England on the condition that he did not return. The relationship between Alice and Raymond was not built on affection, but on a shared recognition of their own obsolescence. They were both products of a world that no longer had a place for them. Alice, the heiress of a slaughterhouse empire, and Raymond, the disposable son of a decaying gentry. Their affair was conducted in the open, often under the indifferent gaze of Frederick, who was more concerned with his hunting trophies and his Bugatti. The valley provided the perfect theater for their psychodrama. The sheer isolation of the Wanjohi meant that there was no audience to provide a moral check, only a mirror of other addicts and social outcasts. Alice began to lose the ability to distinguish between her internal voids and the vast, empty landscapes of the Aberdares. In the Valley of Shadows, the glitter of Alice's diamond served only to highlight the puncture marks of the morphine needles. The hedonism was reaching a terminal velocity, and the descent was about to become physical. Within this vacuum of ethics, Alice de Janze would find the catalyst for a violence that the Happy Valley set could not laugh away. Her obsession with Raymond de Trafford was no longer a diversion. It was a siege. By the mid-1920s, Alice de Janze had perfected the art of the luxury safari, a logistical phenomenon that required more coordination than many small military operations of the era. To the uninitiated, a safari was a hunting expedition. To Alice, it was a mobile palace designed to insulate her from the raw reality of the African bush. A typical 3-week excursion for Alice and her inner circle cost approximately $5,000 in 1925, a sum that translates to over $87,000 in 2026 purchasing power. The technical backbone of these trips was the headman, or neapara, who managed a column of 60 to 80 porters. Each porter carried a 60-pound load on their head, navigating the treacherous terrain of the Rift Valley. The inventory was staggering. Amsler and Comer's double-roofed tents made of heavy green rot-proof canvas, folding mahogany tables, and portable copper bathtubs that required 30 gallons of water to be heated over open fires every evening. While the colonial laborers were paid a pittance of roughly 12 shillings a month, $42 today, Alice's mobile camp featured silver service, crystal glassware, and a cellar of vintage Bollinger champagne kept cool in wet charcoal-lined crates. The weaponry used during these safaris was a display of British precision engineering. The preferred firearm for the Happy Valley elite was the Holland & Holland 2375 Magnum, a bolt-action rifle that debuted in 1912. It featured a muzzle energy of over 4,000 foot-pounds, designed to drop a charging Cape buffalo or a lion with a single shot. A bespoke Holland & Holland rifle in 1925 cost roughly wow's $200, $21,000 today. Yet Alice rarely fired a shot at game. Her interest was not in the kill, but in the theatricality of the environment. She was often seen accompanied by a tame panther, a creature that functioned as a living metaphor for her own predatory and unpredictable nature. The care of such an animal in the bush was a technical challenge. It required a steady supply of fresh, hand-fed meat and a dedicated handler. The presence of the panther, combined with Alice's penchant for dressing in high-fashion silk pajamas while in camp, cemented her reputation as a woman who had successfully replaced social norms with a private, eccentric sovereignty. The macro context of 1925 was defined by the British Empire's return to the gold standard, a move orchestrated by Winston Churchill that led to a significant overvaluation of the pound sterling. While this crippled British exports and led to domestic industrial unrest, it granted the settlers in Kenya, who operated on the pound, an artificial and intoxicating sense of wealth. For Alice, this meant her American-backed trust fund bought even more influence. She was a major contributor to the Muthaiga Country Club in Nairobi, an institution built with pink stone and Italian marble. The club was a masterpiece of colonial architecture, featuring a ballroom with a sprung floor and a bar that never closed. The technical etiquette of the club was rigid. Evening dress was mandatory, and the social hierarchy was enforced by a committee that could ruin a person's reputation with a single blackball vote. Alice navigated this world with a bored disdain, her wealth acting as a universal solvent for her frequent breaches of decorum. Among her contemporaries was Bror Blixen, the professional hunter and husband of Karen Blixen, Isak Dinesen. Bror was the technical consultant for many of Alice's expeditions, a man who understood the mechanics of survival in the bush as well as he understood the mechanics of aristocratic infidelity. He watched as Alice's safaris transitioned from luxury to a form of slow-motion self-destruction. The safari was no longer a journey of discovery, but a fortress of isolation. As the nights grew colder in the Aberdares, the sounds of the gramophone, playing the latest hot jazz records from New York, would compete with the howls of hyenas. The juxtaposition was jarring. A $500, $8,500 today, HMV portable gramophone, utilizing steel needles that had to be changed after every play to preserve the shellac discs, blasting the Charleston into a wilderness that remained fundamentally indifferent to the Armour family fortune. The archive records from this period detail Alice's specific orders from Fortnum and Mason in London. Tins of foie gras, jars of caviar, and specialty biscuits, all shipped via the Suez Canal and the Uganda Railway. These items were not luxuries. They were psychological anchors. Yet as her chemical dependencies deepened, the food often went untouched. The golden lifestyle was becoming a facade for a profound physical and mental decline. The needle marks on her inner thighs were carefully hidden by her custom-made riding breeches from Savile Row, and the erratic behavior that would later lead to bloodshed was beginning to manifest in her treatment of both her servants and her lovers. The opulence of the safari was the glitter on a rotting corpse. The brilliance of the African sun served only to cast deeper shadows over her increasingly frantic movements. Alice was no longer hunting lions. She was hunting an escape from her own skin. The glittering surface of her life was about to be punctured by a needle of a different kind. In the social columns of the 1920s, Alice de Janzé was presented as the pinnacle of the new woman, independent, wealthy, and aesthetically impeccable. She was a frequent subject for the era's most prestigious photographers, including the surrealist Man Ray. The technical process of capturing Alice's image in a 1920s studio was an arduous task. It involved large-format glass plate cameras and long exposure times that required the subject to remain perfectly still for several seconds. The lighting was achieved through a combination of natural skylights and Cooper-Hewitt mercury vapor lamps, which emitted a ghostly, monochromatic glow. In these portraits, Alice's features are rendered with a sculptural coldness, her skin appearing like polished alabaster against the dark silks of her wardrobe. To the readers of Vogue and the Tatler, she was a goddess of the machine age, her life a seamless transition between the ballrooms of Paris and the wild expanses of Kenya. However, the social mask was maintained at a staggering emotional and financial cost. Her marriage to Count Frederick de Janzé was by 1926 a purely legal and financial arrangement. The French laws of the era, under the Napoleonic Code, heavily favored the husband in matters of property and custody. To maintain her independence and her ability to travel, Alice had to ensure Frederick remained financially satisfied. Records suggest she diverted significant portions of her armor dividends, upwards of $50,000 annually, $870,000 today, to cover Frederick's racing debts and the upkeep of his family's prestige. The technicality of their relationship was built on a series of legal contracts that allowed them to live separate lives while presenting a united front to the Faubourg Saint-Germain. This social contract was the only thing keeping Alice from being ostracized by the very elite she despised. The private reality was a descent into neurasthenia, a catch-all psychiatric diagnosis of the time used to describe the nervous exhaustion of the upper classes. Alice's treatment consisted of a dangerous cocktail of barbiturates and opiates. The chemistry of her addiction was rooted in diacetylmorphine, heroin, and morphine sulfate. In the 1920s, these substances were often administered via glass syringes with reusable steel needles that required sterilization by boiling. The physiological effects were profound. A suppression of the central nervous system that provided a temporary reprieve from her chronic depression, followed by a violent crash that required further doses. A single month's supply of high-grade medicinal morphine could cost Alice $500, $8,500 today. A price she paid through a network of discreet chemists in Paris and Nairobi who asked no questions as long as the checks cleared. The secondary characters in this drama, such as her rival Lady Edina Sackville, viewed Alice's decline with a mixture of pity and competitive disdain. Edina's brand of hedonism was robust and celebratory, whereas Alice's was solitary and mournful. While Edina was famous for her bathroom parties at Clouds, where guests would discuss philosophy while bathing in communal tubs, Alice would retreat to her bedroom with a bottle of Mitsuko and a syringe. The perfume itself was a technical marvel of its time, utilizing the newly discovered aldehyde C14 to create its signature peach note. It was the scent of a woman who was both modern and ancient, a fragrance that cost $15 per ounce in 1926, $260 today. Alice used it to mask the sterile medicinal smell of her addiction, a sensory layer of deception that defined her public appearances. By 1926, the macroeconomy was beginning to show signs of the volatility that would lead to the Great Depression. The Florida land boom had collapsed, and the first tremors of agricultural instability were being felt in the American Midwest. The armor fortune, though still vast, was no longer the impenetrable fortress it had once been. Alice's financial advisors in Chicago began to send increasingly urgent cables regarding her spending. A single season in London, including the rental of a townhouse in Mayfair, a staff of 8, and the necessary wardrobe for Ascot and the Royal Garden parties, could cost $25,000, $435,000 today. Alice ignored these warnings. Her focus had shifted entirely to Raymond de Trafford, the man who represented the final, fatal crack in her social mask. Raymond was not impressed by her title or her money. He was attracted to her instability, a trait they shared in equal measure. The two faces of the Countess were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. During a dinner party at the British Embassy in Paris, Alice reportedly sat in total silence for 2 hours, staring at a single orchid in a silver vase, before abruptly leaving without a word to her host. The rumors of her instability began to circulate through the salons of the right bank. The technical perfection of her Man Ray portraits was being betrayed by the dilated pupils and the tremors in her hands. She was a woman living on the edge of a nervous collapse, her wealth providing the means for her destruction rather than her salvation. The social mask was no longer a shield. It was a weight that was dragging her toward a violent confrontation with the one thing she couldn't buy: Raymond's loyalty. The passion for Raymond de Trafford was not a romance in any conventional sense. It was a pact of suicide in slow motion, a final attempt to feel a pulse in a life that had become a collection of expensive, cold objects. The year 1927 represented a deceptive zenith for the European economy. Under the stewardship of Raymond Poincaré, the French franc had undergone a miraculous stabilization, moving from 240 francs per pound sterling in 1926 to approximately 124 by 1927. This fiscal tightening, known as the franc Poincaré, restored a semblance of middle-class security while paradoxically making the lifestyle of the foreign elite even more visible and abrasive to the general populace. While the average French factory worker in the Renault plants at Boulogne-Billancourt earned roughly 1,500 francs per month, equivalent to about $100 in 2026, Alice de Jonzé's monthly allowance from the Armor Trust continued to fluctuate between $8,000 and $10,000, or roughly $140,000 to $175,000 in today's purchasing power. The shooting at the Gare du Nord did not occur in a vacuum. It exploded into a society where the gap between the meat king's granddaughter and the common citizen had become an unbridgeable canyon of resentment. The speed at which the scandal disseminated was facilitated by the technological revolution of the rotary printing press. The French press of 1927 was dominated by Les Quatre Grands, Le Petit Parisien, Le Matin, Le Journal, and Le Petit Journal. These publications utilized massive Hoe or Gauss high-speed rotary presses capable of producing 50,000 eight-page newspapers per hour. The technical logistics of 1920s journalism involved a frantic cycle of linotype operators, lead casting, and bicycle couriers. Within 4 hours of the shooting, the first Edition Spéciale hit the streets of Paris. The black and white truth of the incident was captured by news photographers using the newly introduced Leica de Birbassin, a 35mm compact camera that allowed for candid, high-contrast imagery without the need for a tripod. For the first time, the Gilded Age elite was being hunted by a technology that was as fast and portable as their own scandals. Politically, France was navigating the Locarno era, a period of fragile international cooperation led by Foreign Minister Aristide Briand. The government was desperate to maintain an image of stability and civilization to attract foreign investment. Alice's violent outburst at a major international transport hub was a direct affront to this carefully curated national image. The Gare du Nord was the gateway to London, the very symbol of Franco-British Entente. To have an American countess firing a .25 caliber pistol on its platforms was a diplomatic nightmare. The legal response was immediately pressured by the League of the Rights of Man and various socialist factions who demanded that Alice be treated not as a tragic romantic, but as a common criminal. The cost of her initial legal containment, including 24-hour private security to prevent her from being lynched by the press or completing her suicide attempt, cost the Janzé family roughly 250,000 francs, or nearly $220,000 in 2026. The secondary characters in this legal theater included her lead counsel, Maître René Blum, a man whose fees were as legendary as his oratorical skills. Blum was a specialist in the crime passionnel defense, a strategy that required the technical manipulation of the French jury's sentimentality. He charged a retainer of $10,000 in 1927 dollars, which equates to $175,000 today. His task was to reframe the shooting as a short circuit of the soul rather than a premeditated attempted murder. Meanwhile, the public's mood was reflected in the chansonnier of Montmartre, who began performing satirical songs about the American slaughterhouse girl who treated men like cattle. This cultural backlash was a precursor to the wider rejection of the international set that would follow the 1929 market crash. Archival records from the Paris Prefecture of Police indicate that the investigation into Alice was meticulously detailed. They analyzed the ballistics of the .25 ACP automatic Colt pistol rounds, noting that the low muzzle velocity of 820 feet per second was the only reason both Alice and Raymond survived. Had she used a more modern 9mm parabellum, the narrative would have ended on the platform. The etiquette of the investigation was also notable. Despite being under arrest, Alice was allowed to stay in a private room at the Beaujon Hospital, furnished with her own linens and served meals from the Hotel Ritz. This preferential treatment, which cost approximately $200 per day, $3,500 today, served only to further inflame the public's indignation. The world was beginning to demand accountability for the golden youth, and Alice was to be the first test case of this new, less forgiving reality. The wind blowing off the Seine that spring carried the smell of ozone and wet pavement, a sensory reminder that the storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The French justice system was now caught between its traditional leniency toward the aristocracy and a growing modern demand for equality before the law. The trial would not just be about a shooting. It would be a referendum on whether a trust fund could provide immunity from the shedding of blood. As Alice de Janzé lay in her private suite at the Beaujon Hospital, the true depth of her internal collapse began to surface through a pharmacological fog. The secret was no longer a matter of whispered rumors in Nairobi, but a technical reality that the Janze and Armour families spent a fortune to suppress. Alice was a functional addict of high-grade morphine sulfate, a substance refined through the manic reaction of opium alkaloids. By 1927, the chemical industry, led by companies like Bayer and Merck, had perfected the production of pure morphine. Alice's daily requirement had reached 3 grains, approximately 200 milliliters, a dosage that would be lethal to a non-tolerant user. The logistics of maintaining this habit during her hospitalization required a sophisticated network of discreet medical professionals and the subversion of the Service des Stupéfiants, the French Narcotics Bureau. The legal and social cleanup of the Gare du Nord incident was an industrial-scale operation. Documents from the Armour family archives suggest that a total of $100,000 was allocated for incidentals during the trial period, a staggering $1.75 million in 2026 value. This money was distributed across several layers of the French bureaucracy. It funded expert medical testimonies that reclassified Alice's addiction as acute endocrine imbalance and tropical neurasthenia, terms designed to evoke sympathy rather than condemnation. It also bought the silence of railway employees and hospital staff who had witnessed her catatonic states. The sheer power of the Chicago meatpacking fortune was being used to graft a new, sanitized skin over the raw evidence of Alice's decadence. While Alice was sedated, her material world remained one of static, Art Deco perfection. An inventory of her belongings at the time of her arrest reveals the staggering breadth of her gilded isolation. Among her effects were several Cartier Tutti Frutti bracelets, masterpieces of Art Deco jewelry featuring carved emeralds, rubies, and sapphires set in platinum. A single such piece was valued at $15,000 in 1927, or approximately $262,000 today. She also possessed a Cartier mystery clock, where the hands appeared to float in a block of transparent rock crystal, driven by a hidden mechanism in the frame. These objects represented the technical pinnacle of 1920s luxury, expensive, beautiful, and fundamentally disconnected from the reality of the human condition. Alice lived in a world where time was kept by invisible gears, mirroring the way her own life was being managed by invisible hands. The secondary character in this chapter is Raymond de Trafford, who was recovering in a separate ward. His refusal to press charges was not an act of love, but the fulfillment of a rigid aristocratic code of the gentleman. To testify against a woman, even one who had tried to kill him, was considered a social suicide far worse than a bullet to the chest. Raymond's recovery was managed by Dr. Charles Dujarrier, a pioneer in thoracic surgery who utilized the newly developed Karel-Dakin method of wound irrigation to prevent sepsis. The technical success of his survival was a testament to the fact that the elite could purchase the finest medical interventions the 20th century could offer. Yet Raymond's silence came at a price. He received a gift of 500,000 francs, roughly $440,000 today, from the Janze family to settle his gambling debts and ensure his immediate departure from France following his discharge. Alice's isolation was further compounded by a pile of unread letters from her daughters, Nolwenn and Ingrid, who were being raised by governesses and relatives in England and France. The etiquette of the era dictated that children of the elite be shielded from unpleasantness, meaning Alice's daughters were told their mother was traveling for her health. The cost of this emotional distancing was a generational trauma that no amount of Armour dividends could mitigate. Alice spent her days staring at the ceiling, her pupils pinned to the size of needleheads by the morphine. She was surrounded by $2,000, $35,000 today, worth of flowers delivered daily from the best florists on the Place Vendôme, their scent mingling with the acrid, sweet smell of the opium derivatives she craved. The morphine secret was the pivot point of the trial. Had the prosecution been allowed to present the full extent of her drug use, the crime passionnel defense would have collapsed into a narrative of sordid, drug-fueled violence. But the $1.75 million in hush money held firm. The French legal system, while modernizing, still possessed trap doors for the wealthy. The technicality of the non-lieu, A dismissal of charges was being actively negotiated behind closed doors in the halls of the Ministry of Justice. Alice de Janzé was to be treated as a victim of her own emotions rather than a predator of the station platforms. She was to be pardoned by the court, but the stain on her reputation was permanent. The shadow had finally overtaken the socialite, and the Happy Valley was about to become the only place on earth where she could still exist. The final verdict would prove that while a countess could avoid the guillotine, she could not avoid the slow, agonizing banishment from the world that once worshipped her image. The trial of Alice de Janzé convened at the Palais de Justice on the Île de la Cité, a complex that stood as the architectural manifestation of French legal history. The courtroom, the Chambre des Appels Correctionnels, featured high vaulted ceilings and heavy oak paneling that absorbed the frantic murmurs of the international press. The technical procedure was a correctionnel hearing, meaning the charges had been strategically downgraded from attempted murder to coup et blessure volontaire, voluntary assault. This was a crucial legal maneuver orchestrated by her defense team to avoid a jury trial in the assize courts, where the optics of an American multi-millionairess shooting a British aristocrat might have led to a populist conviction. Under the French Penal Code of 1810, specifically the concepts surrounding provocation and legitimate passion, a crime passional was viewed through a lens of psychological mitigation. The court was not asked to determine if she fired the gun. The ballistics and witnesses made that a matter of record, but rather if her soul had been temporarily displaced by the agony of betrayal. The macroeconomic climate of 1927 France added a layer of extreme volatility to the proceedings. The Poincaré stabilization had successfully halted the freefall of the franc, but it had also increased the cost of living by nearly 15% in just 12 months. While the average French citizen was struggling with the rising prices of basic commodities like bread and heating coal, Alice appeared in court wearing a mourning-inspired ensemble by Lucien Lelong. Her garment, a study in somber elegance, cost approximately 4,000 francs, a sum equivalent to $3,800 in 2026. The technical equipment of the journalists, large-format Graflex speed graphic cameras with their 4x5-inch sheet film, captured her every flinch. These cameras required the subject to be relatively still, but the magnesium flash powder provided a violent, flickering illumination that mirrored the erratic nature of the testimony. The public in the gallery, many of whom were workers from the nearby industrial districts, viewed her with a mixture of voyeurism and profound class-based resentment. The verdict, delivered on December 23, 1927, was a staggering example of class-based judicial leniency. Alice de Janzé was sentenced to 6 months of imprisonment, which was immediately suspended, and a fine of 100 francs. In 2026 purchasing power, that fine is exactly 92,000 bolivares. For the granddaughter of the man who controlled the world's beef supply, the cost of shooting a man in the chest was less than the price of a high-end dinner at Maxim's. However, the true financial drain was the machinery of the defense. Legal fees, private settlements paid to the de Trafford family to ensure their non-cooperation, and the discreet donations made to various French bureaucratic interests totaled over $150,000, or roughly $2.7 million today. Her fortune was not destroyed, but it was being systematically harvested by the very institutions that protected her from the guillotine. The secondary character of the trial was the French public's burgeoning anti-Americanism. The press dubbed her the meat-packing murderess, and the Ministry of the Interior, sensing a political liability, moved to initiate expulsion proceedings. Alice was declared persona non grata. She was given 30 days to leave France, a logistical nightmare that required the liquidation of her Rue de Varennes lease and the crating of her Louis XV furniture. She was also banned from British Kenya for a period of several years. She became a nomadic ghost of the aristocracy, drifting between the Hotel Adlon in Berlin and the Grand Hotel in Stockholm. The etiquette of her exile was one of quiet, expensive disappearance. She spent $1,500 a month, $24,000 today, on travel and sweets, always followed by the acrid, sweet scent of the morphine that was now her only constant companion. Her legal team had saved her life, but they had also finalized her isolation. The archival logs of the U.S. State Department from 1928 flag Alice as a troublesome citizen, a woman whose wealth created diplomatic friction in a Europe already on edge. The Happy Valley mystica was being replaced by a gritty tabloid reality. Alice had won her freedom in court, but she had lost her place in any recognizable society. Her return to Africa, when it finally occurred, was not a triumph, but a retreat into a landscape where the rules were supposedly absent, though the shadows were deeper than she remembered. Without the social scaffolding of Paris, or the distraction of Raymond de Trafford, Alice's mind began to turn inward, constructing a fortress of suspicion that no trust fund could fortify. The acquittal was a victory for the armor lawyers, but for Alice it was a life sentence to a world that now looked at her only to see a monster in leopard skin. By the early 1930s, the Happy Valley of Alice's youth had morphed into a claustrophobic theater of the grotesque. Alice returned to Kenya after her banishment was lifted, settling into Jinn Palace, a residence on the shores of Lake Naivasha that was a masterpiece of Moorish revival architecture. The technical specifications of the house were designed for total isolation. Its thick whitewashed walls provided thermal mass to regulate the internal temperature against the equatorial sun, while the high vaulted ceilings and narrow mashrabia windows allowed for ventilation without exposing the interior to the gaze of outsiders. The estate was maintained by a staff of 25 local laborers whose monthly wage bill was roughly $150 in 1934, $30,600 today. Alice, however, was spending 10 times that amount on her private pharmacy and the spiritual upkeep of her environment. The macro context of the 1930s was the Great Depression, which finally hit the Kenyan colonial economy as the global price of coffee and sisal collapsed. While the rest of the world was tightening its belt and the soldier settlers were losing their farms to foreclosure, Alice's trust fund, though diminished by her father's death and the general market decline, still provided her with an annual income of approximately $45,000, $1,050,000 today. She used this capital to buy companionship. Her lovers were often younger, impoverished men from the colonial fringe, to whom she paid allowances of $250 a month, $5,800 today, in exchange for their presence in her drug-fueled vigils. This transaction was handled with a cold, business-like efficiency. She was no longer a participant in the social life of the valley. She was its financier and its primary victim. Her physical decline was accelerated by the onset of uterine cancer, a diagnosis that in 1935 was a near-certain death sentence. The technical state of oncology at the time offered little beyond crude surgical intervention or early, highly toxic radium therapy. Alice refused both, opting instead to manage the excruciating pain through massive, self-administered doses of morphine and the newly synthesized pethidine. The chemistry of her addiction was now her primary reality. Her skin took on a translucent waxen quality, and her paranoia became clinical. She believed the British Secret Service was monitoring her letters and that her rivals, specifically Edina Sackville, were plotting to seize her estate through legal maneuvers in the Nairobi courts. This paranoia was fed by the constant use of jinns, the supernatural entities of Islamic mythology she believed haunted the palace. She spent over $5,000, $117,000 today, on occult literature and spiritual consultants from the coast. The secondary character of this era was Jocelyn Hay, Lord Errol, who had become the military secretary of Kenya and the undisputed leader of the valley's decadent remnants. Errol was the only one who could still navigate Alice's moods, but even he was wary of the fortress of paranoia. Their relationship was a complex web of mutual secrets and financial ties. Archival notes suggest Alice financed several of Errol's political ventures to maintain a layer of protection from the colonial authorities. The etiquette of their meetings was one of hushed whispers in the white courtyards of Jinn Palace, where the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the medicinal odor of her syringes. Alice had become a dreadful Alice, a woman whom the younger settlers were told to avoid, a living ghost of a scandal they only knew through whispers. As 1940 approached, the world was once again preparing for total war. The British Empire was mobilizing, and the Happy Valley set was suddenly expected to show a patriotism they had ignored for 2 decades. Alice, however, remained locked in her stone palace, a relic of a gilded age that had already been dismantled by the march of history. Her isolation was complete. She had outlived her beauty, her reputation, and her health. The only thing she had left was her wealth, which she used like a weapon against anyone who tried to approach her. She was a woman waiting for a final catastrophe, one that would finally justify the terror she had felt since that morning at the Gare du Nord. The air in the Wanjohi Valley was growing thin, and the laughter of the 1920s had been replaced by the sound of boots on the ground and the distant rumble of a world on fire. The murder of Lord Errol was coming, and Alice de Jonzé would find herself at the center of the crosshairs one last time. By the dawn of 1941, the Wanjohi Valley had been stripped of its hedonistic insulation. The British Empire was engaged in a desperate struggle against the Axis powers, and the Kenya colony had become a strategic front against Italian East Africa. The technical logistics of the region shifted from luxury safaris to military mobilization. The King's African Rifles were reinforced, and the casual decadence of the Happy Valley set was now viewed by the colonial administration as a threat to wartime morale. It was in this atmosphere of heightened tension that the final collapse of Alice de Jonzé's world began. On the morning of January 24, 1941, the body of Jocelyn Hay, the 22nd Earl of Errol, was discovered in his Buick at a crossroads near Nairobi. He had been killed by a single shot from a .32 caliber revolver fired behind his ear. The ballistics were precise. The bullet had entered at a downward angle, suggesting the killer was either inside the vehicle or standing on the running board. The investigation, led by Inspector Arthur Poppy, was a study in 1940s forensic limitations. The technical team analyzed the tire tracks of Errol's Buick and the footprints at the scene, but the lack of modern DNA or reliable fingerprinting meant the case relied on social forensics, the mapping of motives and affairs. Alice de Jonzé was immediately identified as a primary person of interest. Her history of violence, specifically the 1927 shooting at the Gare du Nord, made her a natural suspect. Furthermore, her obsession with Errol had become public knowledge. She had been seen arguing with him just days before his death. The police conducted a search of Gin Palace, focusing on her collection of firearms. While Alice possessed several weapons, including the .25 caliber she used in Paris, the murder weapon, a .32 with a specific rifling pattern, was never found. The cost of the legal defense for the man eventually accused of the crime, Sir Jacques Delves Broughton, exceeded $5,000 in 1941, or approximately $112,000 in 2026 values. Alice watched the trial from a distance, her name dragged through the mud of the international press once again. The trial of Delves Broughton was the final spectacle of the Gilded Age in Africa. It revealed a web of spouse swapping, drug use, and financial desperation that the British government found intolerable during the Blitz. Broughton was acquitted due to insufficient evidence, but the social structure of the valley was permanently fractured. For Alice, the acquittal of another man did not bring relief. It brought the realization that her utility to this world had ended. Her uterine cancer had progressed to a terminal stage, and the pain was no longer manageable even with her massive morphine intake. The technical reality of her death was a calculated pharmacological exit. On the night of September 30th, 1941, Alice meticulously organized her final transition. She dressed in a gown of heavy cream silk, costing $250 in 1940, $5,600 today, and arranged her room at Gin Palace with the same cold precision her grandfather used to organize the Chicago stockyards. The chemistry of her suicide was a deliberate overdose of morphine sulfate. To ensure success, she likely consumed between 500 milliliters and 800 milliliters, roughly 5 to 8 times the lethal dose for a non-tolerant individual. She left 3 notes, one to her daughters, one to the police, and one to her current lover. The contents of the police note were characteristically brief, designed to close the file on her life without providing the satisfaction of a confession regarding Errol. The logistics of her burial were equally specific. She requested to be buried on the grounds of her estate, overlooking the lake. The funeral was a sparse affair, attended by a few remaining members of the set and a skeletal staff. The cost of her final medical care and funeral arrangements totaled nearly $2,000, $45,000 today, paid out from the dwindling armor trusts. Alice de Janzé died at the age of 42. Her death coincided with the end of the White Highlands as a playground for the elite. The macro-political shift was undeniable. The British were beginning to realize that the colonial era was a finite resource. Alice's life, which began in the industrial slaughterhouses of Chicago and ended in a Moorish palace in Kenya, was a 40-year arc of extreme consumption. She had consumed wealth, reputation, and lives with an appetite that was as mechanical as it was tragic. The final act was not a cry for help, but a signature on a life that had become a liability. The black and white truth was that Alice had outlived her era, and in the end she chose the needle over the slow erosion of a world that no longer recognized her. The sun rose over Lake Naivasha on October 1, 1941, illuminating a palace that was now a mausoleum. The silence that followed her death was the first time the Wanjohi Valley had been quiet in 20 years. But while Alice was gone, the ruins of her fortune and her crimes remained, waiting for the scavengers of history to arrive. The liquidation of the Alice de Janzé estate began almost immediately after her burial, revealing the hollowed-out remains of a Gilded Age empire. In 1941, the British Empire implemented the Defense Finance Regulations, which strictly controlled the movement of capital and increased death duties, inheritance taxes, to unprecedented levels to fund the war effort. For the heirs of Alice, specifically her daughters Nolwenn and Ingrid, this meant that a substantial portion of the remaining armor trust was seized by the state. The tax rate on estates of her size frequently exceeded 70% during the war years. After the lawyers, the colonial administrators, and the creditors were paid, the Meat King's granddaughter left behind a legacy that was more debt than dividend. Her jewelry, including the Cartier pieces and the leopard skin coat from the Gare du Nord, was auctioned in Nairobi and London. A Cartier emerald ring that had cost $10,000 in the 1920s was sold for a fraction of its value, roughly $1,500 in 1942, to cover the outstanding wages of her palace staff. The physical ruins of Alice's life followed a predictable trajectory of tropical decay. Jinn Palace, without the constant infusion of armor capital, began to succumb to the environmental stresses of the Rift Valley. The whitewashed walls, once pristine, were stained by the iron-rich dust and the alkaline spray of Lake Naivasha. The technical failure of the Moorish revival architecture was rooted in its materials. The local stone was porous, and without annual sealing, the equatorial rains began to dissolve the mortar. By the 1950s, the Happy Valley was no longer a place of jazz and morphine. It was the front line of the Mau Mau uprising. The British settlers, including many of Alice's former associates, were forced to fortify their homes or flee as the Kikuyu people fought for the return of their stolen lands. The White Highlands were becoming a battlefield, proving that the luxury Alice enjoyed was a temporary anomaly supported by colonial violence. The macro context of the post-war world was the rapid dismantling of the armor and commerce monopoly. The family company, which had once controlled the protein intake of the Western world, faced massive antitrust lawsuits and a shifting consumer landscape. In 1970, Armor and Coopers was sold to Greyhound Corporation, signaling the final absorption of the Gilded Age industry into the conglomerate era. The fortune that Alice had used to buy silk in isolation was now just a line item on a corporate balance sheet. Her daughters lived lives of quiet, aristocratic obscurity, rarely speaking of the mother who had shot her lover in a Paris train station. They inherited the name, but the $1, $8 billion in 2026 value, grandfather's legacy had been dissipated through 2 world wars, several divorces, and 1,000 syringes. The technical legacy of Alice de Janzé is found in the police archives and the psychiatric journals of the mid-20th century. Her case remains a definitive study of borderline personality disorder and substance-induced psychosis, terms that did not exist in her prime, but which perfectly describe her trajectory. She is a footnote in the history of the Happy Valley, overshadowed by the murder of Lord Errol, yet she was the catalyst for its moral disintegration. The Wanjohi Valley today is a patchwork of small-scale farms and conservation areas. Of the grand stone houses, only a few remain, often converted into boutique hotels for tourists who want a sanitized taste of the white mischief era. The cost of a night in a room similar to Alice's today is $450. Ironically, the same as the price of a first-class ticket at the Gare du Nord in 1927. The black and white truth of Alice de Janzé is that she was the ultimate consumer in an age of excess. She took the blood and bone of the Chicago stockyards and turned it into perfume, silk, and morphine. She lived in the gap between the industrial 19th century and the cynical 20th, a woman who had everything but a reason to exist. Her life proves that while capital can suspend the laws of economics for a generation, it cannot suspend the laws of human nature. The blood on the platform and the needle in the palace were the same story. A desperate attempt to find a sensation that the arm of fortune had not already bought and sterilized. In the end, the ruins of Jin Palace stand as a warning. The stone is crumbling, the lake is receding, and the name Alice de Janzé is written in the fading ink of a police file. The fortune is gone, the scandal is a screenplay, and the Happy Valley is just a memory of a time when the world was wide enough for the wealthy to be monsters. In the end, the jewels of Alice were sold, and the blood on the tracks of the Gare du Nord was scrubbed away, proving that not even the greatest of fortunes can purchase a seat in eternity if the soul was already spent in life.